Good afternoon from Japan. Now we would like to start a thematic track session 4 of the International Forum for Sustainable Asia and Pacific, ISAP 2020. The session is entitled Understanding SDG Synergies and Trade-offs for Sustainable, Resilient and Inclusive Development. We are very much honored to invite Professor Takeuchi, President of the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, to moderate this session, together with 4 excellent experts from Europe and Asia to give presentations and join the panel discussion. The session will be 1.5 hours. For the audience who access through YouTube Live, please use the Slido by selecting thematic track 4 to ask questions to the speakers. Now we would like to invite Professor Takeuchi to give the opening remarks and moderate the session. Takeuchi-sensei, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joe. Hello, everybody. I'm chairing this session. I would like to first deliver my opening remarks. The SDGs is an indivisible system covering 17 broad development areas with 169 specific targets. Achieving the SDGs as a whole is important to ensure sustainable, inclusive, and resilient development for all. Through the interlinkages, achieving one goal or one target may impact on achieving other goals or targets. Such impacts can go beyond sectorial and spatial boundaries. For example, increase in agriculture production and intensification in the upstream of a river basin will help reduce hunger, ensure food security, and maintain livelihood of smallholders. However, it may cause water pollution from chemical use and impact water access for drinking water and various uses in the downstream. Effective management of synergies and trade-offs is an imperative task for policy integrity and coherence and prerequisite for achieving the SDGs in a holistic manner. This session, entitled Understanding SDG Synergies and Trade-offs for Sustainable, Resilient, and Inclusive Development, attempts to explore the ways of how to understand SDG synergies and trade-offs, and more importantly, how to address them in the real world based on the scientific evidence, analytical tools, and the practical case studies in China's Yangtze River Basin and the Southern and Southeast Asian deltas. The presentation and discussion will focus around the following questions. How do synergies and trade-offs operate and the impacts on achieving SDGs in 2030? How can the existing frameworks, models, and tools for the analysis of synergies and trade-offs be improved by incorporating the knowledge from the COVID-19 crisis? How can we use the knowledge and analysis of synergies and trade-offs to support practical policy making on the ground? Next, I will invite the first speaker, Dr. Fabrice Luneau, Professor of Environmental Risk and Community Resilience at the University of Glasgow, to give a framing presentation. The title of his presentation is Understanding SDG Synergies and Trade-offs for Sustainable, Resilient, and Inclusive Development. Fabrice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Takeuchi. I will now share my screen. So you should all hopefully be able to see my screen. So thank you again, Professor Takeuchi, for the kind introduction. What I briefly aim to do with this presentation is to introduce cross-cutting elements for the session, while at the same time starting to present research results from a project investigating synergies and trade-offs between sustainable development goals, but at the sub-national scale. This project is called the River Basins as living laboratories for achieving sustainable development goals across national and subnational scales. And it's a cooperation between the University of Glasgow, Nankai University in China, Loughborough University, and the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan. And it is funded by the UKRI Natural Environment Research Council in the UK, NSFC in China, and the Japan Science and Technology Agency in Japan. As we all know, the SDGs, with their 17 goals, 169 targets, and 232 indicators, is an integrated and indivisible framework. Because of that, policies and actions that we enact to address specific targets will have repercussion on other targets in the same or other goals. This was, of course, recognized early on, and a working paper from the International Council for Science proposed a framework which consists of a typology of possible interactions organized on a 7-point scale. So from point 3, where 2 targets may be indivisible, to -3, where these 2 targets may be canceling each other. Since then, approaches have used this type of typology and other ones. For example, here, the work of Fader and co-workers, who computed the total interaction score between different targets for specific sustainable development goals, which is calculated as a sum of competition for input requirements such as water, land and soil, electricity and fuel, synergies in infrastructure development such as healthcare and hospitals, grey infrastructures, etc., and total effects on ecosystem services, particularly provisioning and regulating services. What we can see here is that the labeling they have used is aligned and expanded from the one of ICSU, which I presented just before, and you can rapidly see here the kind of synergies and trade-offs between some of these targets. With time, many more approaches have been developed to study sustainable development goals interlinkages, and this is the table from a review from Dr. Cho, who will speak next. Some cover all the SDGs, others focus on specific SDGs, and some focus on specific targets. The approaches also vary using typologies like the one that I noted before, qualitative analysis or system dynamic modeling. The approach used in our projects, of which I will talk next, is based on social network analysis. So I now jump to the project that I introduced very briefly, the title of in the introduction. Here, I will present a few activities that have allowed us to generate information to look at the synergies and trade-offs between sustainable development goals. Why do we do this analysis at the subnational scale? It was hypothesized that the trade-offs between goals and targets at this scale create inequalities between segments of societies in terms of achieving the sustainable development goals at the national level. And the project aimed to provide scientifically grounded policy relevant information on these synergies and trade-offs between selected development goals within a river basin, and that's the Luanhe River Basin in China. You have here the Luanhe River Basin, which is just north of Beijing and Tianjin. The Luanhe River is the most important water source in northern China. It covers 27 counties in Hebei, Inner Mongolia, and Liaoning provinces. It has a very diversified landscape, from pasture land in the northwest, forested landscape more in the central part, agricultural production in the central part and southern part of the basin. There are many changes in the landscape, including reservoirs that are being developed and water transfer schemes to Beijing and Tianjin in particular, afforestation throughout the basin, to fix soils and in particular to limit sandstorms reaching Beijing. All these policy-led activities will affect the people in the basin very differently. One of the first activities of the project was to understand the current land use, these land uses were also developed into scenarios for projections up to 2030. On the left here you can see the four scenarios. The trend scenario, which basically follows the middle of the road shared socioeconomic pathway, or SSP2. The expansion scenario, which follows the more intensive fossil fuel development shared socioeconomic pathway, or SSP5. The sustainability scenario, which follows the sustainable shared socioeconomic pathway, or SSP1. And then we developed a conservation scenario that takes the sustainability scenario as a baseline and extends implementation of ecological restoration and protection policies and targets. The modeling for the land use changes was done in Clumundo, and the projection of the study periods were between 2015 and 2030. And you can see here on the graph the trends in different types of land uses. And the main conclusions of this component of the research is that the basin is going to experience agricultural, both crop and livestock intensification, and urban growth under all scenarios. The cropland intensification and urban growth rates are much higher in the trend scenario. The forest area are projected to decrease under all but the conservation scenario, and water scarcity in the basin is likely to increase under all the scenarios. Then we applied the Ecosystem Service Potential Index, or ESPI, to estimate the potential of a region to deliver ecosystem services based on ecosystem services matrix for all the land use scenarios. And you can see here the different types of ecosystem services. So the blue line would be the provisioning services, the orange line, the regulating services, etc. And on the bottom of this figure, you can see the dates 1980, 2018, and then the four scenarios projected to 2030. And here we can see that for all of the scenarios, there is a decreasing trend in the SPI. So the ability to provide ecosystem services up to the 2030 trend scenario, and then a slight increase depending on the scenarios for most of these ecosystem services. It is also important to note that clean water is critical for the region and also for the cities of Beijing and Tianjin, which draw water from this basin. And that means that some activities are forbidden. For example, fish cages are banned, which means that this will increase the health of the communities living around these water bodies, because the water is clean. The aquatic life will also benefit, but the economic development very locally will be detrimentally affected. The last component was modeling of flood risk. Colleagues at Loughborough University used the different scenarios that I've presented before, then added the climate change scenario, so the representative concentrations pathway 4.5 and 8.5, and also looked at the impact of infrastructure on the flooding patterns. You can see here sequentially the four different scenarios under the land use in 2030, plus then added the climate change and the infrastructure change. And if we look just at the blue column, we can see that under the trend scenario, we have the most extent of flooding, and this decreases with the other scenarios. If we add climate change on top of that, the flood extent will increase slightly for all the scenarios. And if we put the infrastructure change on top of that, then the flood risk will decrease very slightly. This is perhaps more visible here if you concentrate on the last two images on the right-hand side for the sustainability and expansion scenario. You can see that the flood extent is reduced by the presence of the reservoir. This will have significant local effects, but not so many effects if we take the whole basin. Just to finish, the information presented above, combined with other data sources, is used in a revised version of the Sdg Interlinkages analysis and visualization tool that will be presented in the next presentation. And also, just to mention that two presentations will follow this, look at Sdg Interlinkages analysis at the subnational level, but here focusing on deltas in South and Southeast Asia. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fabrice. Next speaker is Dr. Shin Zhou, Research Leader of Strategic and Quantitative Analysis Center of IGES. Her topic is addressing SDG synergies and trade-offs from an interlinkage perspective, the Sdg Interlinkages tool and its application. Dr. Zhou.
Thank you, Professor Takauchi. Today, I would like to talk about how an Sdg interlinkages analysis and relevant tools can be used to help understand the Sdg synergies and trade-offs from an interlinkage perspective. As we know that SDG goals and targets interact with each other through the intrinsic relationships. As Professor Takauchi already mentioned, a siloed approach without addressing the interlinkages, particularly the trade-offs, can hardly achieve the SDGs in a holistic way, nor ensure leaving no one behind. It is therefore understanding the interlinkages between the SDGs important for integrated policymaking. It can help to address the issues such as how we will achieve one target impact on achieving others, and where are the synergies or the trade-offs between SDGs, and what are the policy implications for priority setting and for institutional and financial arrangement. At IGES, we developed a methodology to identify, quantify, and analyze the interlinkages between the SDG targets. Identification of the interlinkages was conducted based on a comprehensive literature review, expert judgment, and stakeholder consultations. The identified interlinkages were then quantified based on a statistical analysis of the time series data collected for the Sdg indicators in 27 countries. A free online tool was developed to help visualize the Sdg interlinkages and provide national dashboards on Sdg synergies and trade-offs. The users can select a country, goals, and relevant targets. The selected targets and their interlinkages with other targets can be shown on the screen immediately. Since its development in 2019, the tool has been used to support relevant policymaking and development planning at the national and sectoral levels. In the Luanhe Living Lab project, as introduced by Professor Luno, the Sdg Interlinkages tool has been used to help understand the synergies and trade-offs at the river basin level in China. Identification of the Sdg interlinkages for the Luanhe River Basin was based on a literature review and expert judgments from the team members in the UK, China, and Japan. In addition, during the 10-day field trips in October last year, traveling along the upper, middle, and downstream of the river basin, we obtained valuable inputs from local and national stakeholders focusing on the issues related to upstream, downstream relationships and major implications of national policies for the basin. We used the causal framework, the driver's state, impacts, and responses to arrange the identified Sdg interlinkages for the Luanhe River Basin. Drivers include economic growth, rapid urbanization, and major water uses from domestic, agriculture, and industrial sectors. These drive the changes in the state of water-related environment, such as deforestation, soil erosion, and water pollution. Such changes intensify water stress and upstream-downstream conflicts, which may have the feedback effect on drivers and cause other social impacts, such as health, poverty, food security, and employment, among others. Responses to address the water stress and downstream conflicts include management-based approaches such as the integrated water resource management and engineering approaches such as the cross-border water transfer project. However, the responses may also cause the trade-offs such as the interruption in the ecological integrity from long-distance water transfer. We also developed an online tool which is still under construction to visualize the spatial effects of the SDG synergies and the trade-offs across the basin. Here is an example of the upstream-downstream linkages, which shows the downstream impact of cage aquaculture in the midstream reservoirs. Panjiakou and Daheiting reservoirs are the major water source for two nearby metropolises, Beijing and Tianjin. In recent years, the flourishing cage aquaculture in these reservoirs brought economic benefits to the local people and the local governments, support the livelihood of smallholders, and improve local food supply and nutrition. However, negative impacts from water pollution affected the downstream, particularly in Tianjin municipality, to access to safe drinking water, and caused the health problems and polluted the nearshore marine environment in Laoting County. In 2019, the central government issued a ban on cage aquaculture in the reservoirs and forced the removal of all the cages within a couple of months. However, water pollution, particularly the sludge nutrient pollution, cannot be removed immediately nor easily. Another example is the unequal impacts on the upstream and the downstream from the national policy on the designation of protected areas for the conservation of water source in the upstream. And the policy may constrain agriculture production, industrial development, and affect associated livelihoods and jobs in the upstream, such as in Fengning County. On the other hand, the downstream will benefit from improved water quality and access to safe drinking water, such as in Tianjin, and enhance the resilience to water-related disasters in the nearshore areas, such as in Laoting County. However, without proper payments for ecosystem services in place, the upstream will suffer from the trade-offs caused by the national policy. From the interlinkage analysis for the Luanghe River Basin, a couple of key messages are drawn up. Upstream-downstream conflicts from quality-induced water scarcity in the future calls for strengthening environmental management for achieving holistic SDGs in the entire basin. For national policy making, a comprehensive package is needed to take account of trade-offs, particularly in the lagged behind regions and with the vulnerable groups, to ensure equitable development across regions. The wider participation of relevant stakeholders in the policy formation and implementation stages is important to ensure policy integrity by reflecting the concerns from various aspects. Limitations of the analytical tools due to the gaps in data availability and the knowledge about the spatial impacts may constrain their practical applications and need to be improved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe-san. Now, I would like to invite the next speakers. Next presentation will be provided in two parts, jointly presented by Dr. Albert Mutia Salamanca, Senior Research Fellow, Stockholm Environment Institute's Asia Center, and Dr. Jack O'Connor, Senior Scientist of UNU EHS. Their presentation title is Mapping Interlinkages and Localizing the SDGs in Asia's Great Living Deltas during the COVID, Emerging Insights and Experiences. Please start.
Thank you very much, Professor Takeuchi. Colleagues from IGES and the Living Deltas Hub, and those who are joining us online, good afternoon from Bangkok. This presentation is composed of two presentations, as Professor Takeuchi has mentioned, one on interlinkages and another one on localization. The reason for this is that both Jack O'Connor from UNU and myself, and also actually together with Fabrice Rino, belong to the UKRI, or United Kingdom Research and Innovation Global Challenge Research Fund, Living Deltas Hub. And so that we minimize time and we'll just have one introduction, we've decided to make this one presentation with two parts. So the first, can we proceed to the next slide, please? Can I just provide an introduction about the Gcrf Living Deltas Hub? So this hub is being funded by UKRI Gcrf, and it's being led by Professor Andy Large from Newcastle University. And it is composed of at least 30 partners globally. Next slide, please. An important challenge that the Gcrf Living Deltas Hub is addressing is a complex one, which is to avoid the collapse of South and Southeast Asian deltas as functioning, highly productive social, ecological systems in the face of human development and climate change. So as we know, during the Holocene era, the river deltas were in equilibrium. But through time, with increasing human influence, those deltas have been modified, which, next slide please, is getting to a point wherein those deltas will be reaching collapse. Next slide. In this slide, you will see some of the massive developments ongoing in the deltas, and these developments are threatening the health of these deltas into the future. Next slide. So the Living Deltas Hub is looking into 4 mega deltas. So the first one is the Red River Delta in northern Vietnam. The second one is the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam and also some parts of Cambodia. And the third and fourth one are the Indian Sundarbans and the Bangladeshi Sundarbans. Next slide, please. We have 4 overarching questions in the hub. So one of them is about how are deltas changing and what are the key drivers and consequences. And as you can see, these questions relate also to specific SDGs. So for example, question 1 relates to SDG 13, 14, and 15. So we have, as I've said, 4 questions. The second one is how do we learn from lived experiences to build better sustainable futures for delta dwellers? Next slide. How do we maximize capacity building to ensure that no one is left behind? How do we address infrastructure, inequality, and resilience? So that's the Living Deltas Hub. So one of the key things that we pursue in the hub is trying to understand what are the interlinkages from of the SDGs at the delta scale. So we're interested in the interlinkages because we're not just interested about synergies and trade-offs, but we're trying to find out what if there are other dimensions on how the different targets interact from the perspective of the different stakeholders in the delta. We are interested about interlinkages in our work in the deltas because we want to ensure that coherent policies and strategies will be effective. And then, for that to be effective, we need to know how the pieces fit together. And then we want also to assess delta stakeholders on who they should cooperate and negotiate to achieve their objectives and help them implement their priorities. Next slide, please. An important step in mapping interlinkages is to identify how the different targets interact. So we have seen in the presentations of Fabrice and Zoe how some examples of these interactions. Here, we're pushing the envelope forward, so to speak, by trying to understand more in terms of the interaction. So we need to understand if the interaction is irreversible or reversible. Does the interaction go in both directions? What is the strength of the interaction and the certainty of the interaction? So we use this 6-point scale scoring, which has already been presented also by Fabrice. So to do this, we need to score the interactions, which runs from positive to negative. So at the most positive end, you have +3, which is indivisible, and then you have -3, which is canceling. So this is the level of interactions of the different targets. This is an important part in understanding interlinkages because context matters, which means deltas have different geographies, they have different modes of governance, they have different access to technologies, and the level of progress of implementing the SDGs also differ quite substantially. Next slide. Scoring interactions is part of a 3-step process. Here, let me just show that to enable the scoring that we plan to do in the deltas, we're using expert judgment and stakeholder consultations. Next slide, please. And in the next slides, I'll just show you some of the examples on that, how that scoring might materialize. And in fact, Fabrice is a better example shown based on that study by Fader. Next slide, please. And also we can think in terms of the directions of the relationships between the targets. And next slide, as well as the locations of a specific target among the networks of different targets. So next slide. We're interested in stakeholders in understanding interlinkages because we want to ensure that the process of pursuing the implementation of the SDGs is co-created and stakeholder-led. And also we want the process to be responsive of national or Delta priorities, as well as also supporting SDG dialogues at the Delta level. And through that also we hope that we can ensure policy coherence. And then especially in the context of COVID at the moment where there is a competing interest for very limited resources, we need to ensure that that the interventions that will be selected will contribute best to the achievement of the SDGs, given that resources are now really limited, and also to identify opportunities for us to pursue further localization of the SDGs. Here, I'd like to call in my colleague, Jack O'Connor from UNU, to present insights and experiences from enabling or pursuing that localization of the SDGs at the Delta scale. Jack?
Thanks very much, Albert. Yes, so as Albert mentioned, I'm going to be zooming in a little bit to implementation of SDGs at the local scale and how interlinkages may be able to help our progress there. So in the Living Deltas Hub, as Albert said, we're focused on understanding SDGs also at the local level. And here's an example from our work in Vietnam, where we seek to understand how SDGs are being implemented in the Mekong and Red River deltas. by identifying the provinces that have developed implementation plans and how these plans are structured. So on these maps here, the red dots showing the provinces that have plans in place. And it's important to understand implementation of SDGs at this local level, because it's really the front line of development and where the people on the ground are getting affected by these decisions at the national and global level. So a key part of our work is to understand how SDGs can be relevant to Delta dwellers and to identify ways in which the existing SDG framework could be improved to address the unique challenges that are being faced in Delta systems. And perhaps most importantly, to give a voice to the vulnerable people in these regions. As our work is showing, local level implementation is still in the early stages in these regions, with few areas currently having plans in action. And so this gives an opportunity for this SDG interlinkage work to inform implementation at the ground level as it's being developed. And then COVID happened and changed everyone's plans. And so the impact of the pandemic on SDG progress is still being assessed, but its effects, as being shown in this diagram on the right here, are expected to be felt across every SDG. And human development, for the first time, may be reversing its trend since the concept has been monitored. So in our work, it meant that we could no longer access the Delta stakeholders to hold our Sdg interlinkage workshops and perform the work that Albert was talking about. So for our part, the natural plan B, the digital online workshops, the problem is that this could potentially exclude the most vulnerable from participating, as they are often isolated and without reliable access to internet connections. And so this has exposed the digital divide, which is an issue addressed in Sdg 9, tucked away in Target 9C on universal internet access. This is not a synergy or trade-off by itself, but it, of course, is interconnected with other SDGs. And it has serious implications for how SDG interlinkage research of this kind can be done in the future. So we welcome discussion on this point during the question time. Zooming into our regions and to talk a little bit about the human side of it, in the deltas, the effects of lockdown due to the COVID pandemic really hit local livelihoods and industries that were already in vulnerable communities. And then this, in the Sundarbanist region, Cyclone Amphan hit. And in this multi-hazard context, the impacts of the cyclone and extreme weather, which perhaps they're almost used to facing by now, were occurring at a time when people were uniquely vulnerable from the COVID pandemic. And this exacerbated the effects of both the COVID lockdown and the cyclone, pushing the capacity for response of local governments to the limit. The responses also faced novel challenges. So for example, cyclone victims were being evacuated to shelters, which conflicted with the response measure to COVID, where they were trying to introduce social distancing. So a paper recently submitted by the Living Deltas Hub goes into this multi-hazard context and its implication for the SDGs in this framework here. I know it's a very complicated document, but very simply, it looks to incorporate the pre-existing risk in these areas, their vulnerability and exposure to natural hazards, and then explores how these impacts interplay with each other in this multi-hazard context. Each has its individual impacts, but they end up creating feedbacks between each other and exacerbating long-term impacts. The part of this diagram that I want to talk about, though, for this talk is this section up the top here on pre-existing risk and vulnerability and how interlinkages may be able to address this to create more resilient, sustainable development. Particularly focusing on environmental SDGs. So through our review of the SDGs in the Delta countries, it's clear that the environmental SDGs are lagging in terms of progress relative to other goals. This is illustrated in the Sdg Index Dashboard, which is an online tool providing a visual representation of each country's performance by SDG expressed in trends. And we see over here for each country, we have identical trends in each of the environmental SDGs, 13, 14, 15, where trends are stagnating or decreasing. Here for SDG 13, the trend looks a little bit better, but it should be noted that the indicators used for that trend were only for CO2 emission and not related to targets like 13.1 on risk and vulnerability. These trends are particularly important in the context of COVID, where the zoonotic nature of COVID, which meaning the relation between human and animal interaction, is increasingly being looked at as a root cause, increasing the risk of pandemics due to the loss of natural habitats and biodiversity. In addition, we've seen that government responses are reactive and focus mainly on mitigation in the economic and health sectors, which is of course understandable. But what I'd like to talk about in terms of synergies is a proactive response, recognizing the importance of progress with the environmental SDGs, identifying opportunities for synergies that can increase resilience of development. So in terms of the synergies and trade-offs of the environmental SDGs, I won't go into all the relevant ones for 13, 14, and 15 because they've been identified before. They're largely intuitive. And what I wanted to just quickly mention here was specific synergies relative to building resilience in a post-COVID world, so particularly in that context. You may have heard the term build back better being used by UN entities when talking about COVID recovery. I like another term, build back greener. And this communicates that the environmental SDGs are critical to our COVID recovery and renewing progress in human development. And so I'd like to focus here on the potential to reduce vulnerability to risk from future novel systemic shocks that could play out in the multi-hazard context way of which I described earlier. So up here, nature and green spaces can feed into issues of health, sustainable cities, and reducing inequalities, while increasing the resilience of people during crisis via mental health and well-being benefits. And I think that almost everyone on the planet can relate to during lockdown, not being able to go outside, let alone making it to a green space and having a realization of the importance of nature in these green spaces to our mental health and resilience. This can apply also for natural ecosystem restoration, ensuring that local communities have access to provisional ecosystem services that support livelihoods, nutrition, and biodiversity. So during the pandemic, we've seen local inhabitants lean on these ecosystems as a safety net when incomes and supply chains fail. And all of this feeds into SDG 13, in particular, contributing to climate change mitigation, and the target that I mentioned was not monitored on the dashboard, 13.1 on reducing risk and vulnerability. Using environmental SDGs in this way is referred to as eco-DRR. And one last aspect I wanted to mention is that the pandemic may have positive environmental outcomes. And we have some stories from our Delta partners of how this may have played out. And it could have some important lessons for policymakers for managing SDG synergies and trade-offs as we emerge from COVID. For instance, during the lockdown in the Sundarbanist, locals reported more fish caught in the rivers and at larger sizes, attributed to the discontinuation of commercial fishing due to market closures during lockdown. Tigers were more frequently encountered by those entering the forest illegally, and that often didn't end well, but it seems to indicate nature reviving itself. And so this should be considered the trade-offs between commercial interests and environment as we go forward. Back to you, Albert.
Thank you very much, Jack. So why are we interested in interlinkages and localization? So primarily, these are the reasons why we're pursuing this twin approaches in our SDG work. One, we need to identify the so-called accelerator interventions and critical clashes among Delta level SDG targets. We want to identify also resource-effective options, especially in the context of COVID, wherein a lot of resources are now being used to address the pandemic. And then we want to induce interagency policy dialogue and partnerships. And of course, we're interested also in providing guidance for coherent policies, coherent and locally responsive policies. And last, but certainly not the least, is we want to enable local partnership of the process. With that, we're looking forward to your questions and or queries in our presentations, and we'd be happy to respond to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both Albert and Jack, for your presentation. The last presentation, but not the least, will be provided by Dr. Eric Zassman, research leader of Sustainability Governance Center of IGES. His presentation is entitled Governance for Integrated Approaches to the SDGs, Application to Water Management. Eric, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Takeuchi-sensei and colleagues for inviting me to participate in this incredibly rich and interesting session. I'm going to focus a lot on some of the governance issues that will either facilitate or frustrate more integrated approaches to the SDGs, and I'll put a lot of emphasis on water management issues. So as an entry into this discussion, I'd like to just highlight that a lot of the work I initially did on environmental policy focuses on an issue that is also featured in this session. My initial interest in environmental policy began with a look at China's Yellow River Basin, and in particular, some of the issues coordinating upstream and downstream uses, what we might call issues related to spatial coherence, was nicely highlighted in several presentations previously. I mean, I started doing this work approximately 30 years ago or so, and at that time there was definite challenges of trying to coordinate different types of user groups from upstream and downstream, and also from agricultural, urban users, and residential users. And this led to a situation where we can see in this slide right here that this Yellow River, which is considered the birthplace of Chinese civilization, if you would go visit the Yellow River approximately 25, 30 years ago, at the place where it flowed out into the ocean, you would discover that unfortunately there was no river there. I mean, it was a dry riverbank. And so these images of basically this very famous river without water in it prompted a lot of my interest in how can we govern what are sometimes called common pool resources, especially when these resources have multiple purposes, multiple users, and span across multiple boundaries. And I think this issue, of course, remains quite salient today. And it's been featured, of course, in this session in the context of the SDGs. And I think, you know, we've made a lot of progress since 30 years ago in understanding how to manage these common pool resources. And understanding that is partially a reflection of some of the tools now that can reveal to us where there exist different linkages. So this very short diagram or simple diagram shows you linkages between the different targets of the water goal SDG 6, and as some of my other colleagues have already revealed here, that there are, of course, linkages not only within the targets, but of a single goal, but across targets and across different goals themselves. And I'll talk a little bit more about the linkages between water and especially climate change. But as I get into that discussion, one of the things I want to highlight is and I think is critically important, is as we make advances with the tools that we can use to analyze these different types of interlinkages, I think we also need to bring in some of the research on governance to understand, once you've determined what the physical interlinkages might look like, what types of governance arrangements are necessary to achieve them. This type of question, of course, is relevant to my earlier research on the Yellow River Basin and is incredibly relevant to the SDGs. And this diagram or figure right here highlights some research that we've done around those questions. This comes from a study that my colleague Simon Olsen and I did with the Asian Development Bank. And basically what we tried to understand is what were some of the challenges to implementing, especially the called environmental dimensions of the SDGs. In this context, we focused on SDG 12, SDG 14 and 15, so that's sustainable consumption and production, life below water, and life on land. And what we found from doing interviews with policymakers in 15 different countries is that the key barriers to working on these issues, and especially working across the different targets and goals of these issues, were very much governance related. So coordination between different ministries, technical capacity and human resources, availability of human resources, costs of collating data, and then identification of indicators and competing demands from different interests and user groups. So I would put 4 of those 6 barriers under the category of governance, and some of them also fall under the category of data. And so one of the key questions then is, when we think about managing a river basin, or we think about how to deal with the SDGs, what types of governance models are out there to analyze these issues? And the model that we've worked with a lot here at IGES is what we'll call the multi-level, multi-stakeholder model. This model underlines the importance for integrated approaches of horizontal coordination across different government agencies with different sectoral mandates. It also underlines the importance of vertical coordination or vertical integration, working across different levels of decision making. And last but not least, this stakeholder engagement, or creating opportunities and avenues for what we'll call the ABC coalition: academia, business, and civil society. Not featured here, but I would underline is incredibly important, especially when we talk about no one left behind, is of course participation in decision-making processes and inclusivity, especially in some of the bureaucratic processes that determine allocations of resources. So this general model then offers us an opportunity to look at specific problems. And one of the specific problems that we tried to use this model to look at was the linkages between climate change and, in this case, not just water use, but wastewater management. And what we did is we used a tool that's, it's a little bit different than the Interlinkages tool, but it has some of the same logic. And we looked at a series of different technologies that would help us to manage wastewater. And what we found is some of these technologies would be have the potential to reduce not only wastewater pollution, but also mitigate climate change. And this is largely coming from energy use from using those technologies, or methane that's emitted from the wastewater. So several of these technologies can give you what we call co-benefits for climate change and wastewater. But a few of them, and typically the sort of more business as usual technologies, focus more at the end of the pipe. And those end of the pipe technologies are good for dealing with water pollution, but not so good for climate change. So this number 1 technology, which happens to be the technology that's promoted under the national wastewater law or water law in Indonesia, where we did this work, is not so good for climate change. And then this becomes problematic as we start to build in some of the governance work, is that when we don't have good coordination across agencies that are focusing, in this case, on wastewater and climate change, but as those agencies and other actors build up their capacity and are better able to implement, in this case, the national wastewater law, they scale up those technologies that have these trade-offs. And so what you have as a result is the implementation of the national wastewater law without this integration across different agencies leads to a significant increase, in this case, in greenhouse gases, and actually widens and expands some of the trade-offs. So this underlines that when we think about governance, we need to think about not only building capacity, but also facilitating coordination across different agencies. And I think this will be important for SDGs, be important for water management, and important for our discussion to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. Now we have about 30 minutes time for the discussions. I would like to ask the panelists to answer to the question that I will ask to you. First, I would like to ask Fabrice, can a subnational assessment on synergies and trade-off be easily carried out? The data ready for us to be used today, and if not, how can we proceed?
Yes, thank you very much. The issue is, of course, going to be the availability of data. It's already complicated enough to populate all the indicators at the national level with data. And of course, this adds a layer of complication if you go at the subnational scale. In our project, some of the data were collected at the county level when they are available. And when data are not available for specific SDGs, you can use proxy indicators and then do activities like we have done in the project. For example, using modeling, using scenarios, using expert knowledge to generate data that can be used then to feed some of the indicators. They become proxy indicators, but they can help us assess the synergies and trade-offs between the SDGs. So you saw, for example, that we were able to generate very spatially explicit data from the land use modeling, the ecosystem services modeling, the flood modeling that was done. And that can also be projected in time and can be used to see the trajectory of these proxy indicators with time.
Thank you very much. Because this issue is very important of integrating the quantitative analysis with on-the-ground activities. And therefore, if you have any further comments, I would like to invite. Yes. Jo-san.
Thank you very much for this question. I think during the development of the Sdg Interlinkages tool, we also faced the lack of trackable data or lack of well-defined indicators for the quantification of the identified interlinkages. And through this Luanhe Living Laboratory project, actually, we benefited a lot from stakeholder consultations, which provide their insights on the potential interlinkages and whether the interlinkages are strong or weak, and whether their importance for the Luanhe River Basin. And so I think the stakeholder consultations and in a combination with expert judgment will be very helpful to fill in the gaps in data availability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question to Jo-san is how can the SDGs interlinkage tool help bridge science and policy, particularly strengthening of science policy interfaces?
Thank you very much for the question. So as I already mentioned, during the field trips traveling from the upper, middle, and down to the downstreams. we received a lot of valuable inputs by talking with local people and local officials or the institutions. We understand the local context from their kind of inputs and insights, and also know how the national policy or their concerns about the national policies for the local development. So these are very invaluable to customize the identified interlinkages for the real case. Also in the policy making processes, I think the involvement or engagement of the stakeholder are very important because through hearing their concerns and their perspectives, particularly the trade-offs can be taken into account in the policy making, which will avoid or mitigate the potential trade-offs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask Albert, how does interlinkage analysis lead to change in SDG implementation at the local level? Do you have any ideas?
Thanks, Professor Takeuchi. Understanding the interlinkages would be quite crucial in terms of identifying which among the interventions to apply given the many contending priorities of the government. So through the process of mapping the interlinkages, stakeholders would be able to identify which among the interventions they would have to pursue that can achieve maximum benefits given the sort of the limitations that they have in their situations. So that's really crucial because as we've always been discussing about the SDGs, they are not indivisible. So one cannot choose which among the targets or which among the goals to pursue because of so many reasons. But by going through a conversation among the different stakeholders together, they can make a decision that for the current context that they're currently encountering, a specific target would help them achieve what they plan for that particular time frame. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask Jack, you mentioned about the impacts of COVID-19. How do you consider about the long-term impacts of COVID-19 in the relation between the people and the watershed management?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think in terms of the long-term impacts of COVID-19 in the deltas, something that we need to be careful about is the way in which governments make their response, because these can have potentially positive impacts in the short term, but in the long term, negative impacts. And if we don't identify those and account for those at an early stage, we may be exacerbating problems further down the timeline. For example, our Delta partners have informed us of issues in the response of governments to remote islands where the locals are not managed in a way that they are able to social distance correctly, that they are able to use proper PPE. And so as relief reaches these areas, it's again increasing the COVID risk for spread. In addition, in supplying relief in the form of water and clothing, this is often distributed in small plastic bags inside larger plastic bags inside larger plastic bags, which are dumped along the riverbanks and often ignored by the locals. And all of this material will then be entering the delta and will need to be dealt with later. These are just a couple of examples of how the rush to respond, if it's not thought through correctly, can have long-term impacts, which will then interact with the impacts from the pandemic itself.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Eric about the current reports on the triple R framework response to the COVID-19.
Yeah, thank you very much, Takeuchi-sensei, and also thanks, Jack, for making this remark. At IGES, we're currently working on what I'd call an integrative framework for action that focuses on COVID response, recovery, and redesign. And I think this is quite relevant to the point that Jack was raising. Basically, what we're suggesting is that as policymakers make decisions in the wake of COVID, they need to consider sort of three different types of coherence. One is in terms of timeframes. And this gets directly to the point that Jack raised, is, I mean, the response needs to be consistent with the recovery, and also simultaneously we need to think about redesign. So responses are sort of narrow interventions that deal with an immediate problem. The recovery are decisions that are sort of broader policy reforms, as well as allocation of stimulus to put us on a different development trajectory. And then the redesign is thinking more about some of the institutional changes or hardware changes that you might need to different types of systems, whether it be water management systems or urban systems or transportation systems. Each of these different Rs has a different time horizon on them, different spatial consideration, and they also appeal to different stakeholder groups. But the key point that we're trying to emphasize when we try to recommend this framework is that the three Rs need to be aligned with each other to drive transformative change. Otherwise, you're just going to get sort of piecemeal, short-sighted changes that might have, as Jack suggested, big trade-offs down the line. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are some questions from Slido. I would like to introduce these questions, and I would like to ask some of you to respond. First one is, who should be responsible for water pollution when food produced in the watershed is exported? And is there an international framework to address? Maybe Fabrice?
I'm not aware of an international framework to address this issue, but it is clear that there is a shared responsibility in terms of who has to be accountable for the consequences of food production, particularly in terms of water pollution. But also the actions that would be taken to prevent that pollution need to be equitable, I would like to say. And you've heard from the two presentations, mine and Dr. Joe, the case of Panyaku Reservoir, where the new reservoir allowed for example, fish cages to be put in the reservoir, and that provided livelihoods to local communities, but also generated a lot of pollution. And because the water is very important for other regions outside the Ruanghe River Basin, the policy decision was to preserve the water resource and therefore to stop aquaculture basically in reservoirs. And the water quality then started increasing positively, but with time. But on the other hand, a lot of people lost their livelihoods. So here, perhaps a more balanced policy decision in this kind of situations would be to try to provide either alternative livelihoods to the communities who are affected by this, or to provide incentives to have more or less polluting production processes. And that's what I want to emphasize. The responsibility has to be shared. It shouldn't be one group of people who is being negatively affected at the expense of another one, either by the pollution or by the solution to the pollution.
Thank you very much, Joe-san.
I think this is an excellent question. I think this is an excellent question. related to externalities from an economic viewpoint. So I think I don't know much about whether there's an international framework for addressing this, similar to what Fabrice already mentioned. But I think perhaps the internalization of the environmental cost in the whole production process, and particularly in the final product, is one of way to help solve the problems. If this is properly done, and not only related to the food production, but I think also related to the GHG emissions, how to internalize the climate change prices into the carbon pricing system, I think it's a kind of similar way to address the issue. And if this internalization of the environmental cost be properly implemented, the upstream can raise the funds for pollution control at the site. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question goes to maybe the Jack and Albert. Question is, how difficult is it to overcome the jurisdictional aspects in SDGs governance across borders, for example, in the Sundarbanist Delta?
Jack, would you like to answer it? Or maybe I could go ahead first and then Jack can come in and add more information. I think it's quite hard, especially in the Sundarbans, because of historical sort of geopolitics between countries involved there. So primarily the relationship between India and Bangladesh. So I think if we have to succeed in managing the Sundarbans, we have to take into considerations how we can bring in these two countries together and to think in terms of the overall welfare and future of the Sundarbans. At the moment, I think that there might be some opportunities. I don't know whether Fabrice can add on that one or Jack, but certainly quite limited because of the existing nature of the relationship. So in other words, it's still a challenge to bring in two powers together or two countries together to talk about the future of a particular delta. This is also the same also in the case of in the Mekong Delta, wherein part of the Mekong Delta is located in Cambodia. So bringing in the Cambodians to be part of the management and the governance of the Delta, I think it's still a challenge, but one that might be possible if we just be persistent in our approach to working with these two countries.
Yeah, and I'd just like to follow on from Albert there and talk a little bit about the Living Deltas Hub. So we're actually following up on the issue raised in this question, and we'll be seeking to form trans-boundary partnerships that encompass
and to some extent political science about how you actually create these type of fora. I mean, I think to some extent, this is happening through the research directly. So I really applaud the efforts of my colleagues to reach out to local communities and ask them about, where the interlinkages exist and how they see them operate in their own local context. But in order to really institutionalize participation in decision-making fora, there's a lot of experiences, I think, that could be brought to bear on this work that would make sure that, there's a constant flow of information and ideas and inputs so that when we think about interlinkages and integration, we're also thinking about inclusion. And so I guess my first point is we need to bring in some of those researchers that have knowledge of those areas to to institutionalize inclusion. And then the second point, and this is related to that, the previous one, is we've seen a lot of emphasis in recent days and I'd say over the past maybe 2 years on what I would call the just transition. And this just transition concept has its origins in work on fossil fuel industries and especially transitioning out of coal. But I think that there's a rich ground to explore its application in other areas and to other stakeholders. So in other words, I don't think this is just about trying to bring in workers into decision-making processes or trying to make sure that there's green jobs for people. But for instance, when we start thinking about water management issues, how do we make sure that there's opportunities for disadvantaged stakeholders to justly transition into new scenarios or new settings? What I would like to see is, from a researcher's perspective, is a broadening of this discussion of just transitions and its applications to other media besides fossil fuels. And I think the work that's being done here also offers some good opportunities for that type of exchange. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We still have 10 more minutes, and so I would like to ask all the panelists to say a few words at your last comments, starting from Fabrice.
Thank you very much. In conclusion, what I would like to say is that in terms of research, a lot is going into the analysis of the synergies and trade-offs in the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is very important, in particular, when we see that development is not linear. By that, I mean what Jack has been discussing with the COVID crisis coming in to play and really changing things very dramatically. And therefore, we need to be able to develop tools that allow us to capture these great uncertainties so that we can perhaps anticipate or at least have in place policies that can be more reactive than what we have seen so far in terms of supporting the most vulnerable affected by these extraordinary events. And limit the impacts on the development processes and all the development gains that have been, reached since the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you very much. Next, Jo-san.
Thank you very much for all the speakers. And I also want to echo what Fabrice mentioned on the COVID-19 impacts and also recovery measures actually presents a huge research agenda for us to know about how COVID-19 will impact on achieving the SDGs and how the response or recovery measures will either help achieve the SDGs or impact on achieving them. And so at Aegis, I think Eric already mentioned that we developed this 3 R's framework to structure the issues and to find the feasible solutions to address the challenges. Also, I think from this session, we learned a lot from how achieving local level SDGs or the subnational level SDGs is also very important, except for monitoring and reporting on the progress at the national level. But so far, knowledge and research at these levels are still very limited, and we have a lot of work to do in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I would like to ask Albert to say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Takeuchi. I agree with what Joe and Fabrice mentioned, but I just want to add that the COVID situation also has really upended our ability to engage more with stakeholders, because in the first instance, we didn't want to be the one who's bringing the infection to them, especially if we come underground. And at the same time, also, we didn't want to be infected. And when we come back to our organizations, we didn't want to be quarantined. So in terms of the practice of our engagement and being that guided by that ethos of being consultative, I think it has really affected us. And I'm not sure to what extent we will be able to go back to that time when it's just easy for us to just come down to the field and talk to different people. Because right now, maybe doing that in the middle of the pandemic might not be the most responsible thing to do. So certainly, the COVID situation has not only affected research, but it has certainly affected the way we engage on the ground.
Jack?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to quickly highlight a few points raised by my colleagues here in the group today. One by Zhu on addressing trade-offs, and I guess this links into the discussion on addressing barriers, focusing on governments that Eric was also talking about. I think that in synergies and trade-offs, depending on the field, synergies are often looked to and trade-offs are often ignored. And if we want to overcome the barriers that, for example, policymakers may have to adopting the changes that we suggest, we really need to put the trade-offs in the front and center and address those. And I guess from my side, the point that I want to underline is that I think COVID has really shown the vulnerability not just of people around the world, but of our concept of sustainable development and the SDGs. And these kind of shocks, these unpredictable shocks, or not widely expected shocks, can be increasing in the future. And we can't see now what they're going to be. So I think the key is to increase resilience and use our knowledge on interlinkages to really build and resilience and reduce vulnerability of people and our development processes to hazards and disaster.
Thank you very much. And Eric?
Yep. So yeah, thank you very much, Takeuchi Sensei and colleagues. I really like the direction that this discussion has gone, and I think we've really learned a lot from each other. So really appreciate that. I'm going to make a few closing points. The first one is, I mean, of course, when we think about COVID-19, this has been a tremendous tragedy, and I think we cannot obviously forget the loss of life and other stresses on, mental stresses as well as economic stresses. At the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind this quote from former Nobel Prize economist Paul Romer, is that crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And I think in this context, I mean, there's been a lot of research about how exogenous shocks or jolts from sort of outside the system can provide the impetus for transforming some of the challenges within the system. And I think this is particularly important when we think about, overcoming barriers, because I think a lot of times what we find in terms of barriers to working on synergies is they're not just one barrier, but there's actually multiple interlocking technological, institutional, social barriers that are perhaps augmented because they're interlocking, they're interacting with each other. So crisis can sometimes break down those multiple interlocking barriers, and I think that we have an opportunity to do that here and now. And I think from a researcher's perspective, there's 2 points that I think can help push that forward. One is how do we actually move some of the modeling that's being done here into government decision-making processes. I don't think there's been enough research on how governments actually internalize and mainstream some of this modeling work. So the integration of the modeling into government and governance, I think, is important. And then simultaneously, I think the other direction also matters. So how do we take some of the governance research that I've highlighted and also bring it into some of the modeling work? For instance, if we have fragmented institutions, what are the implications for trying to achieve interlinkages, and how does that get reflected in our modeling? So this interface between modeling and governance, I think, is important as we think about how to fill this space that's opened by this crisis.
Thank you very much for all the contribution by the panelists. I would like to a little bit summarize from my perspective, the takeaway messages. First one is my feeling in my long history of teaching and studying that the quantitative groups are separated from the on-the-ground groups. So this uniqueness of this panel is try to integrate it, quantitative modeling with qualitative the governance to really meet the current challenges that we are facing. And also, it is quite important, interlinkage analysis could be combined with the on-the-ground activities. These are the very important aspects for us to level up of the interlinkage analysis. So interlinkage analysis, not just the quantitative analysis by computer, but it could include some important meaning to be applied on the ground. And on the ground activities could find out the way to move forward under the framework of the SDGs. So both of these activities are quite beneficial once we try to take an integrated approach. So this is a very important message that I understand by the panel discussions. And second importance is that in order to understand the post-COVID-19 sustainability, still immature for us to really make important presentations to the society, but we must consider, and one of the important things is that the COVID-19 is the crisis, but at the same time, is an opportunity to transform our society. And therefore, from this perspective, we need to further develop our ideas, particularly interlinkage analysis on the ground activities, how we could further address to the post-COVID-19 sustainability. This is another very important message I could learn from your discussions. And the third point, the last point, is that how we could integrate it, SDGs goals and targets. This is very important. My understanding that many people, either in the government, local government, or in the private sectors, they are taking and picking up some SDGs goals and targets and to discuss. And we are doing very good things for the achievement of SDGs. But they are ignoring the importance of the synergies and trade-offs. And therefore, we need to discuss all the SDGs goals and targets and to understand the synergies and trade-offs. And also, we also need to consider with the linkage of the linkage between the SDGs and climate action and conservation of the ecosystems and ecosystem-based disaster risk reductions. So integrated approach is another very important aspect that we further need to address, and we recognize and we agree to take this approach. So by saying that, I would like to conclude this session by thanking to all the panelists and all the participants to this session. Thank you very much.